Before the Greeks ever whispered of Amazons riding through the steppes of Scythia, before Rome trembled at the thought of women who severed their own breasts to draw their bows with deadly precision, the ancient lands of Bharata already knew of them. They called them by different names. They wove them into epics so vast that the stories could fill lifetimes. And unlike the distant tales of the Mediterranean, these warrior women didn't just exist in faraway lands. They walked among gods, challenged princes, and altered the course of cosmic wars. This is not the story you were told in school. This is not the sanitized mythology of temple walls. This is the blood-soaked, thunderous truth of the female warriors who carved their names into India's greatest epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and then vanished from popular memory, erased by centuries of retelling that preferred their sons over their swords. But here's what they don't want you to know. These women didn't just fight. They ruled, they conquered, and some of them nearly brought the mightiest heroes of India to their knees. So let me ask you this. What happens when a warrior queen meets a god in disguise? What happens when an army of women decides that men are no longer necessary? And what happens when the greatest archer in Indian mythology faces a warrior princess who refuses to be conquered? The answers will shake everything you thought you knew about ancient India. Our story begins not in the courts of kings, but in the wild spaces between civilization and chaos. The forests, the island kingdoms, the mountain fortresses where patriarchy's grip loosened just enough for something dangerous to emerge. In these liminal spaces, the epics tell us there existed kingdoms ruled entirely by women. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, actually ruled by warrior queens who trained their daughters in combat, who rode into battle pregnant, who made alliances and broke them with the same ruthless precision as any male monarch. The Mahabharata, that colossal epic of 18 books and 100,000 verses, speaks of them in whispers and asides. The Ramayana, older still, mentions them in passages that scholars often gloss over. But they were there, always there, waiting for someone to finally tell their stories. Let's start with the most explosive revelation, the kingdom of Kasi and its princess Amba. But not just any princess, a warrior trained since childhood to fight, to lead, to refuse submission. When the mighty Bhishma, the grandfather of the entire Mahabharata, the warrior who had taken a vow of celibacy so absolute it became his name, arrived at her Swayamvara to abduct her and her sisters for his nephew. He thought he was performing a simple dynastic duty. This is not a metaphor. This is the literal text of the Mahabharata. Amba immolated herself, was reborn as Shikhandi, raised as a daughter, transformed into a son, and then on the battlefield of Kurukshetra became the weapon that finally brought down the invincible Bhishma. Think about what that means. A warrior princess so consumed by the need for justice that she transcended gender, death, and rebirth itself to claim her revenge. The Mahabharata treats this as fact, not fantasy. Shikhandi stood before Bhishma's chariot, and the great warrior, recognizing the soul he had wronged, lowered his weapons. And Arjuna, hiding behind Shikhandi, unleashed a rain of arrows that pierced Bhishma's body so thoroughly, he hung suspended above the ground on a bed of shafts. Amba got her war, and she won. But Amba is just the beginning, because if you dig deeper into the Mahabharata, past the famous battles and philosophical dialogues, Amba didn't weep, she didn't plead, she demanded to be released because she had already chosen another man. And when Bhishma complied, that man rejected her as used goods. So Amba did what any warrior would do. She declared war against Bhishma, against the entire Kuru dynasty, against fate itself. For years, she trained. She sought out the greatest warriors, begged them to fight Bhishma on her behalf. They all refused, because even gods feared the man who could choose the moment of his own death. So Amba went further. She performed tapasya so severe that her flesh burned away, standing on one leg in the forest for years, eating nothing, drinking nothing, until the god Shiva himself appeared before her, disturbed by the sheer force of her rage. And here's where it gets truly mythological. Shiva granted her a boon. She would be reborn as a warrior. She would be the one to kill Bhishma. But the most explosive warrior woman story in the Mahabharata isn't even about the Great War. It's about what happened before, in the forests of Mahakoshal, where there lived a queen named Hidimbi. Hidimbi was a Rakshasi, a demoness, if you trust the translations that want you to think of her as a monster. But here's what the text actually says. She was tall, powerfully built, trained in illusions and combat, and served as a guardian of the forest realm ruled by her brother, Hidimba. When the Pandava brothers, fleeing for their lives, stumbled into her forest, Hidimba sent his sister to kill them and bring him their flesh. But Hidimbi saw Bhima, the strongest of the Pandavas, a warrior whose appetite for battle and food was legendary. And she made a choice that changed everything. She transformed herself into a beautiful woman, approached Bhima, and told him the truth. Her brother wanted them dead, but she wanted something else entirely. She wanted him. She was a single mother, a queen, a warrior, and she did it all without asking permission from the patriarchy that eventually wrote her story. The epic treats her with surprising respect, too. When Gatotakacha is killed in the war, the text describes Hidimbi's grief as one of the war's great tragedies, equal to any of the noble mothers who lost sons. She wasn't marginalized. She wasn't demonized. She was simply powerful. Now, let's cross into even stranger territory, the Ramayana, and the warrior women who almost nobody talks about. Everyone knows Sita, the perfect wife who walked through fire to prove her purity. But how many know about the warrior women who served in Ravana's own court? The Ramayana describes Lankini, a demoness warrior who stood as the guardian of Lanka itself, a gatekeeper so powerful that no one could enter the Golden City without facing her in combat. When Hanuman arrived at Lanka's gates, Lankini didn't ask questions. She attacked. Here's where we need to talk about what all of this actually means, because these stories aren't just entertaining myths. They're windows into a worldview that ancient India held and then deliberately forgot. The warrior women of Indian epics aren't portrayed as unnatural or grotesque. They're not cautionary tales about women who stepped out of line. They're simply there. They fight, they rule, they love, they scheme. They win and lose with the same complexity as any male character. The Mahabharata doesn't moralize about Hidimbi's choice to pursue Bhima. The text doesn't condemn Amba for seeking revenge. What happened? How did a culture that casually mentioned kingdoms of warrior women evolve into one where the idea of a female fighter became almost unthinkable outside of the goddess Durga? The answer is as depressing as it is predictable. Colonialism, yes, but more importantly, the deliberate rewriting of these texts during the medieval and early modern period. So what does all of this mean for us, here, now, thousands of years after these stories were first told around fires and in royal courts? It means that the warrior women of Indian mythology aren't foreign imports from Greek Amazon tales. They're indigenous. They're ours. They were woven into the foundational stories of Indian civilization itself, and they've been systematically forgotten, not because they weren't important, but because they were too important. They represented a possibility that later generations wanted to suppress. that women could be warriors, rulers, autonomous agents of their own destinies, without requiring permission or redemption through perfect virtue. Amba didn't need to be pure to demand justice. Hidimbi didn't need to be demure to claim her desire. Ulupi didn't need permission to take what she wanted. These women were mythological precisely because they represented something beyond the normal, but they weren't condemned for it. And maybe, just maybe, they're waiting for this moment, for a generation that's finally ready to hear that ancient India wasn't the simple patriarchy that colonial scholars and conservative reformers wanted it to be. That it was wilder, more complex, more gloriously contradictory than anyone wants to admit. The warrior women of Indian epics are back. They never really left. They were just waiting for someone brave enough to tell their stories again. But what they didn't know was that the real storm hadn't even begun. Because in the shadows of these myths, in the margins of these epics, there are darker tales still. Stories of warrior women who didn't just fight men, they hunted gods. And those stories will burn everything you thought you knew about Indian mythology to the ground. But that is a tale for another time.